let's introduce a woman that never gets any time off. No, I'm just kidding. But she's a friend of the show. She works for the editorial board for the San Francisco Chronicle. Emily Hoeven, thank you so much, friend,
Yay.
for coming back on the show.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Long time no see.
I know your background looks a bit different because for
Mhm.
everyone that doesn't know, Emily was living in Sacramento. She has officially moved to San Francisco. And I guess let's start off with this personal story you shared, and then we'll get to Proposition 1 after. Emily moved to San Francisco, and I'm going to let you tell the story, but you quickly learned how ridiculous things, laws, rules can be in the city of San Francisco.
Yes. So I moved here last month, so it's still really new to me and exciting. And I've been loving living in the city so far. But yeah, there are certain hurdles that I encountered almost immediately. And one of them was the super simple task of just getting a permit to park my moving van. Because so when I was in Sacramento, when I moved there, when I left there, I didn't have to get a permit. Like it's super chill. It's like more residential. There's enough space. So it never really even crossed my mind that I would need to do that. And then my parents were like, well, you might need to get a place to like reserve a spot for your van. And I'm like, that's probably true. So then by the time that I realized this, it was maybe like a week or so before I was actually going to move. So I was Googling around and I came across this website that is managed by the city's transit agency. And it was so confusing to me to even understand what that site was talking about in the first place. I'm like, is this the right
Is
place?
this real? Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, is this the right area? But the long and the short of it was, from what I could deduce, was that you could apply for a permit, but it required at least 5 business days worth of processing time between the date of application and the date of enforcement. So not including those days. So that is more than a week when you add it all up, because it's only 5 business days in a week. Not only that, it cost a minimum of $320 for the permit. And if you were going to be in a metered area, it would be another $16 per meter per day.
Wow.
And I was like, I don't even know if a moving van takes up one space or more than one space. Like it's very unclear, like how many things you would actually have to apply for. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, so that's going to be like $350+ to literally park my van for like 30 minutes or an hour.
Yeah.
And the thing that's crazy is like, it's not even guaranteed that it's going to be like right in front of your building. It's wherever they can kind of fit you in compared to like other permits that have been issued and things like that. So I was sort of like, does it even make sense to do this? Because even if I go through this process, first of all, I don't even have, like, I'm not even going to be able to meet the deadline for this in terms of the time, because I have less than a week. But even if I could, should I actually pay that much? I mean, because renting a U-Haul costs like $30 and another $30 if you want to insure it. Like, it's so cheap. It's insane. And so basically my family and I, we kind of decided to just take our risks and double park, because also when we had been touring different apartments, we saw a ton of people doing that.
Yeah,
it was like really customary.
Exactly.
People take up a whole lane on the street, like a lane of actual traffic. They just throw some cones out and we're good, call it good.
Yeah, like we were noticing that, and we were seeing like the UPS truck or the mail truck, like everyone just kind of parks in the middle, puts their blinkers on, and like does what they need to do.
Yeah.
So we were like, okay, we'll post someone as a sentry to kind of guard and make sure that, you know, no one breaks into the van, and also that there isn't some sort of enforcement coming on. And if there is, we'll move the truck. But we ended up double parking, and the hilarious irony of it was, literally right as we pulled up, another moving van pulled up right in front of us and did the exact same thing.
Right.
So I was like, what the heck? And so essentially I decided to write a piece just kind of explaining.
Admitting that you are not following the rules, which I love.
I know, I felt so guilty. Like, you know, even when I was talking to, because I talked to the transit agency, and I'm like, look, like, I'm not someone that, you know, enjoys or makes a habit of breaking the rules. Like, I don't, you know, and that's the whole purpose of the piece that I wrote, is that I think generally speaking, most people are going to want to abide by the rules, right? Like if there's a permit, they're going to get a permit. But when it's so much time and so much money to do the right thing. It incentivizes people that even have like the most pure of intentions to try to circumvent the rules. And, you know, a lot of readers pointed out to me that the fine for double parking is only $108. So it's like basically 1/3 the cost of the permit. So why
just break the law then?
So
you
why
know?
would you get the permit? Like, and this is, you know, it does not make any sense. And, you know, the transit agency was like, well, you know, it's the cost of the enforcement and the materials and the labor and all of this stuff. But
no
then
one's going to do that. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And then I'm like, but the signs are literally like paper that they just like zip tied to a tree. Like, how expensive is that? You know what I mean? And then also, it was clear to me in talking with them that there are a lot of ways they can make that process more efficient and thereby reduce staff time and thereby lower the cost. Because, for example, they were telling me that a lot of their workers have to spend a fair amount of time basically going back and forth with people and explaining the process, and people will submit the wrong application because, again, the website is so confusing that it's not really clear which permit you need to apply for, how far in advance you need to, because they have different timelines, different things, different like caveats. And so I'm like, well, I think if the website was made a lot more clear, you probably wouldn't get as many incomplete or invalid applications. People would have fewer questions. And yeah, I see the comment there. And I actually got so many reader responses to this article, which I did not expect at all. Like I opened my inbox and my email was like blowing up with people like full of frustration and having their own like horrible stories that my editor and I were like, well, maybe we should just do a follow-up piece kind of outlining some of those experiences and just talking to talking to some politicians and see what things they might do to address this issue. But I think my favorite story that I got from a reader that was what would have probably had me pulling my own hair out of my head was this one woman got a permit to put her moving van in front of her building. The signs were put up. She paid the $320. She got it up there. So she gets there on the day of the move and someone has torn the signs down because, as I mentioned, it's paper. It's like you can easily tear it off or whatever.
Right.
So people had done that so that they could park their own car in that spot. Right.
Right.
So then she calls MTA, the transit agency, and she's like, someone tore down my signs. Like, I can't park my van. So then they send out this parking enforcement officer and they're like, well, we can't tow the car because there's no sign reserving the spot. And she's like, no, they tore down the signs. Like, that's exactly why I called you. And they were like, well, we can't tow it because there's no proof that like you reserved this.
Oh my.
She was like, wait, what? And so then finally she called them back and she was like the cars are still here. So then 2 hours later, she said, they finally sent someone to post new signs. But at that point, I mean, 2 hours, she had already had to park somewhere else and do the move that way.
Right.
So she was like, I paid the money and I didn't even get the product and I didn't get the refund. And then someone was telling me that they couldn't tow the car because there was no proof that my signs were there. She's like, but that's why I
God. Yeah.
So frustrating.
I mean, is this giving you pause to move to San Francisco, Emily? Because this is what you are going to have to deal with. You know that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely did not expect it to happen so soon when I got here. I mean, it was before I even got here, you know, and at first I was kind of like, maybe I'm being a bit of like a crybaby about this. Like maybe this is a little thing. But the more I talked with folks in the city, the more I realized that these are the exact like little quality of life things that they keep piling up. And sooner or later, you have people who are so fed up because the most simple things are so complicated. There's no reward for doing the right thing. And like many readers told me that they did pay that permit, which they were shocked that it was that much, but they were like, you know what, I want to do it. I'm going to follow the rules. They get to their building and their landlord's like, oh, like you didn't need to do that. You could have just double parked. Like no one actually takes it seriously. And so it makes it difficult to like have faith in that process. And I think especially when there are stories of obviously, you know, people, you know, selling drugs on the street or living on the street. And then MTA also for years, as the Chronicle kind of exposed, was wandering around ticketing stolen cars and charging the owner of the car for the ticket, even though the cars had been stolen. So it's like this backward system where it seems that following the rules is actually punished in a lot of ways, or you're made to feel like you're kind of a sucker because everyone says, no, you don't actually need to do that. Like, it's
like, why did you waste all that money doing that? You did not need to do that.
It's like no good deed goes unpunished kind of a thing is like really the vibe that I got from a bunch of readers that reached out to me. And I actually just got another email this morning from a woman who told me that they had, again, reserved a permit for their moving van. And then apparently the city had also double booked them with another permit. So at the same time in the same place for their own workers to like paint the curb a certain color. So the workers were like, well, you can't like park your van here. And they were like, no, like we need to move. Yeah. And so it's just, there's all of these things that seem like with the technology we have, with the resources we have, with being one of the richest, cities in the world, you would think we would have a system that kind of puts all of those things in some sort of database so that you don't double book. If someone says my signs have been torn down, they're not like, what signs?
Exactly. There'd be some sort of database, some cross-referencing. Right. You think the heart of Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley in and of itself would have the best websites, the clearest everything. Yes. And I think it's also really disappointing when you come face to face with the fact that that's not how it is. And yes. I feel for you, Emily, because now you live in San Francisco. You're probably going to be encountering situations like this all the time.
Yeah, well, it will be interesting. And, it's so funny because already I love living here so much. Like,
you do good.
In terms of like the vibrancy of the city, like it's there's so much going on. I feel like I've already had more of a social life in like 3 weeks here than I had in 4 years.
Wow.
In Sacramento. And I think part of that is due to COVID, and just kind of recovering from that. And just from being from the Bay Area, I just feel like there's more of a built-in like network here that I have. And obviously I'm going into the office and see my coworkers, which I couldn't do in Sacramento. So I definitely am not like a San Francisco hater, but what I do want to do is approach it from the angle of like, there's so many great things about the city, but we really need to like get back to basics here because things that are so simple. And again, the city is trying to lure people back. It's trying to lure businesses here. It's trying to lure residents back in. Those fees should not be so exorbitant. Cause I mean, like that was a cost prohibitive fee for me. And it would be for many people. I mean, Absolutely. How could you pay that much for a couple? And the thing that doesn't even make any sense is a yearly parking permit is $170. So why is one for less than 24 hours double that cost? Like I logically do not understand it. Yeah.
I think that's like kind of the motto of San Francisco. We logically don't understand it. All right. Well, let's move on to Prop 1. And I'm so glad. Welcome to San Francisco. So glad you're in the Bay with us. Let's move on to Prop 1. The headline in your opinion piece is Proposition 1 is too close to call, even though the other side has conceded. I think even today, I think they're still counting the ballots. And you said Governor Newsom should never have left it to chance. And some people are saying, I never even saw any ads for Proposition 1. I feel like, and maybe it's because of our news bubble here, we talked about Proposition 1 a lot. I don't know if it's the algorithm with my Hulu. I saw Newsom's ads for Proposition 1. Kim, you said you never saw an ad for Proposition 1. One, obviously this other side has conceded it's looking like it's going to pass, but why do you feel like it was so close?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of reasons why I think Prop 1 is so close. And this is basically like one of the centerpieces of the governor's strategy to overhaul the behavioral health system, get sickest people off the streets into housing, into mental health facilities. But so, on its face, that sounds like a good idea. And like, obviously we as an editorial board supported it. And there are a lot of reasons why we did support it. But I think for the average voter encountering this measure on their ballot, there are a couple of reasons that they would have kind of hesitated about it. And I mean, the measure is insanely complicated. It took up 68 pages in the state voter guide, which I think is a modern day record. And I believe the Secretary of State said added a cost of several $1 million to the election because they had to print all of those voter guides and send them out to people. So it's extremely complicated. I don't think anyone was sitting there reading through every single line of the statute, right? And part of the reason why it's so complex is because it amends a prior voter approved ballot measure that essentially raised a 1% tax on millionaires to fund county mental health services. And what the state is trying to do with these amendments is increase oversight of that spending and basically tell counties a lot more clearly how to spend that money, whereas in the past they had a lot more discretion, and the state wants more of that money to be used on housing people who are severely mentally ill and providing them with services, rather than of a focus on like prevention and early intervention, although that still will have funding. So it was super complex, and I think that was a big issue. I think the second issue was the other part of Prop 1, which in addition to those amendments, separately, it would authorize about a $6.4 billion bond that the state would use to create about 10,000 placements, either in behavioral health facilities that would have to be constructed or in permanent supportive housing for people who are mentally ill or using drugs and are homelessness or on the verge of homelessness. And I think that bond, in my estimation, was a big reason why people were very skeptical, because the reality is that California taxpayers have funneled more than $20 billion into homelessness, like in the past 5 years alone. And in that time, homelessness has only increased.
Yeah.
And we only seem to see more and more people on the streets who are in crisis. And I think there's a very, very strong sense of skepticism and dissatisfaction and distrust that any more money given to the government for this issue is going to actually make a difference, because, why has it not in the past? And so I think those were some of the biggest reasons why. And I think thirdly, all of those ads that some people did see were very heavily like Newsom focused and Newsom branded. And this was Newsom's initiative, and he had $12 million from his own campaign funds that he was using to promote the measure. The opponents had literally no money at all, like $2,000. So they had no ads whatsoever. But I think Newsom might have overestimated what his endorsement would mean for voters, because his approval rating right now among Californians is actually the lowest it's been since he assumed the governorship. Wow. And so I don't think people are necessarily like, oh, Newsom likes it, therefore I like it too.
Right.
So I think that's it. And I think, again, when voters are confused by something, they're far more likely to vote no than they are to vote yes. And so my argument with this whole thing was that I support the idea of what Prop 1 is trying to do. What I think they should have done is, I think that $6.4 billion should have been addressed in the past several budget cycles. Because if you'll remember, California had record-breaking surpluses. Last year and the year before, it was about $100 billion. They did use some of that money. They did use several $1 billion to funnel it towards behavioral health. However, they have also described Prop 1 as the linchpin of their behavioral health strategy. So my argument was, if it is indeed so central to your strategy and so necessary to make all the other components of that strategy work, why would that have not been a funding priority when you had a surplus? Why would you have not allocated another $6.4 billion when you had all that money at your disposal, rather than ask voters for that money when we're in the middle of a sizable deficit, which some are estimating upwards of $70 billion. And it's going to cost more money than it would have had you done it that way, because now that it's bonds, we're going to have to issue debt, and it's going to cost an additional $310 million annually for 30 years. So it is less cost effective, and it is more uncertain than it would have been when you had the money, you actually put it towards that goal, which I think that they should have done, because it's a goal that I support. We clearly need those facilities. We clearly need more placements. So my beef was not with the measure in as much as it was with the governor's way of handling it. And I think that it really goes down to how Democrats have addressed the budget deficit in Sacramento. I sort of feel like the past several years, there were a lot of warning signs that the economy was not going to, stay in that mode forever. There were reports saying, okay, yes, we're in a good space now, but we have a very volatile, tax base and stock market, things are going to go down. We're going to be in a deficit. Lawmakers knew this, but they still allocated so much money to things that, and at the same time, they're asking for more money. And I feel like, and for example, in November, they're going to be putting billions of dollars of bonds on the ballot for climate, for housing, for education, various other things. And they're actually haggling right now over what's going to make the ballot, because they can sense that voters' appetites are not super high to approve bonds. Anyway, so I just think Democrats have not been responsible. I think they've wanted to have their cake and eat it too. And I think instead of making tough choices when they had a lot of money, they're pushing off the hard decisions.
Yeah.
And I think that it's only going to make a lot of things more difficult. And one last note I'll say about why the measure is so close right now is I think part of it had to do with the fact that it's in the primary election. And we know that the primaries tend to be lower turnout. They tend to skew a little bit more conservative than the general election. And so I think that, Newsom was trying to kind of clear the plate. There were actually other measures that were going to be on this ballot, and he like steamrolled lawmakers and convinced them to push it to November so that no one would be distracted and everyone would just be focused on Prop 1. But again, like the turnout is going to skew a little bit more conservative and a little bit lower turnout. And so that's going to also decrease the margin. So there were a lot of things that I think kind of backfired for him. But I think the biggest issue in my mind is the lack of fiscal responsibility and wanting to, use every single dollar of the surplus and then keep asking the voters for more money. It's like you had the money, and instead you are asking us to pay even more when we could have done what we're trying to do and saved billions of dollars in the process.
I just feel like, I agree with everything you're saying. I wonder also the nuts and bolts and the details of Proposition 1, making sure that the human infrastructure that we constantly talk about is going to be there. Are you optimistic now that it looks like it is going to pass, that we're going to see significant improvement in the homelessness, in the mental health crisis? Because a lot of people, and they've been saying it in the comments, they're worried about taking away money from counties doing this.
Yeah.
I always respond, look, it's been getting worse. I remember vividly, was it last year or the year before, Newsom saying, these nonprofits, I'm not giving you any more money. It's gotten worse the more money I've given you. And that's also true. I'm concerned that going from the top, from the state down, loses a little bit of the nuance that's involved county to county in dealing with the problem, because the situation in San Jose and San Francisco is different than it might be in smaller counties.
Absolutely. And I think that is one of the biggest concerns that is there with the measure is the state is going to be increasing oversight. It's going to be taking a slightly bigger portion of the money to kind of administer oversight and also to invest in workforce development for that healthcare workforce that we do need so desperately. It's a difficult thing to weigh because we don't know what this is going to look like once it comes out. And I know a lot of folks have been telling me, like, we don't even actually understand fully the implications of what this is going to mean for our counties, especially because there are so many other things happening at the same time. For example, CalAIM, the state's massive transformation of its Medi-Cal healthcare program for low-income Californians. They're totally overhauling that. So, for example, now Medi-Cal will pay for 6 months of transitional housing because it's considered like a healthcare expense. So there's all of these shifts that are ongoing, and how all of those are going to intersect and interlock, I think, is very much TBD. But I do think that for me, when I look at our current situation, I think it would be a mistake to think that continuing down the exact same path that we've been on for the past several decades with MHSA, the things that's been reformed with Prop 1. I mean, the results have not gotten better, unfortunately. And I'm not necessarily blaming any specific group of people for that, like counties or local nonprofits. But I do think that when the state kind of decentralized a lot of its operations, whether it was from the state prisons down to the county jails, from the state hospitals down to these, local behavioral health centers that oftentimes didn't even materialize due to lack of funding. When it did that with mental health, I mean, that used to be really handled at the state level. And then there was kind of this realignment down to the county level. There's pros and cons of that. And the pro is obviously the counties have a bit more flexibility. They can tailor it a little bit more. The con is that I sort of feel like every county can also define things in its own way and move in its own direction. And those directions may not be like mutually compatible in some ways. And I do think there needs to be an overarching strategy and goalposts that we're trying to, as a state, move toward. And there should be flexibility within those parameters. But I do think that generally speaking, there needs to be I don't want to say a top-down direction, but there needs to be a clear
leader,
vision. And I don't know that we've had that as a state for the past for the past several decades. And I think part of it is because the state was abdicating responsibility and it didn't want to be held accountable, right? It wanted to say, oh, if homelessness is increasing, it's the county's fault. Well, now that the state is taking more of a leadership role, they're also going to be held more accountable. And I think that that's really important, because we can say, look, like you said you were going to step in and you were going to do this. And if you're not delivering, well, that's also your problem too.
Yeah, exactly. And it's going to fall on Governor Newsom as well. And I know he's not running for re-election, but obviously he has bigger political aspirations that are going to follow him as well. Emily Hoeven with the San Francisco Chronicle editorial board. Read both of her articles, including the one on her parking fiasco. It's in the show notes. I love it. I love your writing. We love your analysis. Can't wait to get you back on the show. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.